Well, we're seeing those numbers start to level off. I think everybody's here. More will join us. Welcome. We're glad to have you back for the second part of our Research to Practice Bites webinar series, a little mini series here on pitfalls, common pitfalls in our attempts to shift toward a safe system approach within our road safety programs. We're talking about pitfalls, and we're talking about how to avoid them and maybe shift toward what truly is a more safe systems compliant approach to road safety. And so last month, we shared, our panelists, Eric and Seth, I'll introduce them shortly, shared a list of common pitfalls, 10 of them to avoid. We're going to revisit that list, and then we're going to really just have a discussion with our panelists. You shared great questions last time, and you have the opportunity to share them today. We'll get into that discussion and just use our full half hour for that, responding to these questions. Housekeeping before we start, we want you to use the speaker view option. That's the best way to see all of our panelists simultaneously. We'll mainly just be on camera today, no real slides to share or anything like that. Participants, you're muted, but we're all discussion based today, so please send in your questions through the questions pane. You can do that at any time. We are recording the session, and so we're going to post that to the CFCRS site so you can look at it later or share it with a colleague. Our two panelists, again, joining us today, Eric Dumbaugh of Florida Atlantic University. We're glad to have him back. And Seth, LaJeunesse at the UNC Highway Safety Research Center here. Thank you for rejoining us. And thanks to all of you for coming back to listen in on this discussion and participate. On the next slide, we have a list of the 10 pitfalls, common pitfalls toward creating a safe system that Eric and Seth shared last time. I'll breeze through these briefly. And then what we're going to do is start to discuss some of the questions that came in from you all following the last webinar. So here they go. Number one, the pitfall is to do more of the same to address traffic injury. The second is to set uninspiring and unethical safety goals in your safety plans. The third pitfall is talking about crashes as isolated, unpreventable accidents. Fourth is designing roads that are completely separate from land use. The fifth pitfall is equating shared responsibility with equal responsibility. We'll be getting into that a little bit more today. The sixth item here on this list of pitfalls, base our land use and transportation decisions on forecasted traffic. Seventh, relying on only one agency to conduct serious crash investigations, The eighth pitfall is decouple project planning and programming from the safety goals in long range and Vision Zero plans. Ninth is to assert that compliance with design manuals will automatically result in better road safety, another topic we plan to get into a little bit more today. And then 10th, finally, we assume that technology will save us all, being another pitfall toward creating a safe system. So that's the list. We included that in the archive materials for the previous webinar, and we talked about each one, Eric and Seth did. So if you want more detail on them, please refer to that webinar. But we're going to kick off the discussion here with one of the items we shared, number 9. Actually, a lot of you had interest in this topic, particularly if I can broaden it out a little bit. It's the role that traffic engineers, designers, and our design manuals play in determining the types of work we can do and the types of safety work that ultimately ends up being done. So I guess I wanted to start this discussion with a question that came in at how do we, within the design manuals that we all know well, how do we move toward a safe system approach? Are we able to, within the constraints of some of these design manuals, or do we need to be thinking outside the bounds of some of these materials that we've got on deck? Eric, I wonder if I could start with you on this one. This was a big question. A lot of people wondered about this.
Yeah, a lot of times when we talk design manuals, the first thing that comes to mind is the AASHTO Green Book. We hold it up as this villain that prevents us from creating good urban streets, and particularly with urban areas. But the reality that I think most people miss is there's a lot of flexibility in here. And I think before one criticizes that, and trust me, I'm not going to be the first to defend this manual, it's got its problems, but if you conceptualize what sort of design you want and you go through the Green Book, there's nothing that would preclude you from doing that, right? That most of the stuff that is reasonable from a pedestrian safety, from a speed mitigation, from all these, you can do that within the Green Book. The problem, I think, comes not with what's in that manual itself, but with the requirement that design engineers exercise professional judgment, right? That they need to determine what values to use when they're going forward with the design. And there's a tendency to sometimes believe that the higher value is the better one. So just like, when you're doing structural design and you want to design a bridge, for example, for a load that's much greater than what you expect, the same sort of mindset often goes into street design, which is, well, if 11 foot is great, 12 foot's better, right? If a 10-foot clear zone is good, then a 12 foot is better. That tendency sort of comes in, but there's nothing in the Green Book that requires you to do that. So, to start with that, I think we need to be clear that the barrier isn't necessarily in what's in these manuals themselves, but in the manner in which a lot of the people who use them conceptualize the function and purpose of streets.
Great points. Seth, you want to add on any of that?
Yeah, I wanted to underscore what Eric was saying around the Green Book, if you will, the more common parlance for that, right? Often we'll hear in the field that these are considered standards, when in fact it's really guidance. To Eric's point, there's a lot of flexibility in there. And that relates to, again, going back to some of the basic principles, which we can expound upon later, Dan, basic principles around safety for all road users. But yeah, just want to underscore that.
Okay. Yeah, it's a good point. And I think, there were time and time again in some of the questions brought up, there's definitely a balance. And we talked about this typical balance between we have safety and then we have mobility. And moving vehicles a lot of times and protecting and saving lives. How are you seeing, I should rephrase it, the way the person asked the question, do you see it as a promising move to rethink? We don't have to do away completely with mobility, but what if we think about moving people in multitude of different ways rather than simply moving vehicles? And that seems to change this balance between safety and mobility. We're talking about moving people, but also keeping them safe. Maybe that could be one path into to kind of adjusting our approaches to engineering and some of our goals overall in transportation.
I would think to some extent, Dan, yeah, this idea of reconceptualizing what we mean by mobility, if we think about all road users, that is probably one way we can get there. There are some frameworks from abroad, like in Oceanica, where we have in New Zealand, for instance, where they have sort of this movement in place framework. There are some places on the network where it makes sense, where we do focus more on mobility, on movement of people, of all different types of travel modes and goods, right? And others where we want to create more of a sense of place. I think what they mean by place, we're really talking more about the access or the ease of getting to destinations that are desirable. It's this idea that, and Eric, this too, right? Is that on some of our facilities, I'm thinking more like urban and suburban arterial facilities, there's often this tendency to want to combine the best of both. I think Charles Marone might call this a futon, where you get, it's just doesn't function as a couch or a bed as well, where you're trying to get both mobility and access. So the point is, I think as road designers, road operators, it's really thinking about what is the primary purpose of this and designing it that way. If it's mobility, you really do have to control access, right? Through driveway consolidations, through controlled sort of intersections and stuff. And then if it's about access, you really do need to start thinking about, the speed of traffic, of motor vehicle traffic, the mixing of road users themselves. How are they going to interplay in space, particularly in your conflict zones, both mid-block and at intersections and stuff like that. So it's really just a rethinking of, I think movement of different road user groups, but also to start thinking, what is the primary purpose of these facilities? And can we really get the best of both if we try to integrate them, like in a lot of our, quite dangerous urban arterial facilities? Eric, I'd love to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, no, I would follow that. One of the things that distinguishes practice in the US versus the rest of the developed world is this idea that we can have our cake and eat it too. That somehow we can have safe urban streets that also move a lot of traffic at high speeds. You go into what New Zealand's adopted, you go into what most European countries have adopted. And if you're dealing with an urban context, it's capped at 50 under the kilometers per hour, so 30 miles per hour, under the best of circumstances. There's no situation where you would have 40, 45 running through an urban area. You just don't do it. It's antithetical for what that street does safely. And the difference here is that if we're going to deal with safety, safety has to override that. I mean, then we try to get into this thing realistically where we're really bartering lives. How many lives are we willing to sacrifice to move traffic a little more efficiently? And we try to balance that out. But the one roadway network classification system that New Zealand uses, Germany has a great one too. They don't do that. I mean, it's antithetical to what street design should be. And again, this gets to this issue that we have with conceptualization, where in the frameworks that these countries use, land use context uses are embedded straight into the street design. Whereas here, we've got this local collector arterial, and then now Astro is trying to bring in the new urbanist context zone system and some sort of overlay with that, but it still separates those pieces out. And I think getting the fusion of these things together, understanding that the right design is a function of context and road users is really what we need to do. And which is why the manuals even the better ones, the ITE one, the NACTO one, there's nothing they're recommending that you can't do under the Green Book. The real innovation here, such as it is to try to get people to broaden their thinking about what a street should do. Right. And really, we need to take that next step and say, really just follow what our international peers who have been successful are doing, right? Just look at what's worked, which is everywhere else.
Yep.
Look at that and we'll start bringing those into our practice.
I think this resonates with folks out there. Some good comments coming in that safety versus mobility is only problematic when only the people in cars count. But if you can broaden that definition, you can move a lot of people with a train down a corridor, and all of a sudden you're starting to make things a lot safer for all road users. You're minimizing the traffic, and pedestrians can cross a lot of common threads here in some of the questions and comments coming in. Let me shift gears. We can always come back to this, and really all of you out there, we want to gear this discussion about what you're interested in. Send in those questions, even if they're comments. I'd love to incorporate those into the discussion period. But let me shift toward one of the principles, or the pitfalls, I should say, that was shared last week. There were a lot of follow-up questions about this one, and it was about the idea of shared responsibility. And we're talking about moving away from an evenly shared responsibility for the system, and instead placing more emphasis on the responsibility for traffic deaths and injuries on those who maybe have more of an impact or a say in how the system is designed and operated. I think that was the point that you all made last week, but I wanted to just ask if you might quickly summarize that pitfall again, and maybe what the move away from that might look like. I believe we talked about maybe a more equitable distribution of responsibility for traffic deaths and injuries. I wonder if, I don't know who would be in a position to take that one first.
I'm happy to weigh in on that, Dan. It's a philosophical question, really. I think there are probably two problems with the way that we're seeing shared responsibility framed right now. One is the way it's framed, it is framed in the terms of that we all share it equally. And there is some really great work in the fields of psychology that shows basically when we all are told that we're responsible, or we all feel responsible, then none of us feel responsible, really. Albert Bandura, who's a kind of a famed psychologist, identified that in a lot of his work. There's a diffusion of responsibility. If we're all responsible, then none of us are. And then secondly, if we keep the idea that road users are responsible for what happens to them on the roadway, then that always leaves the door open, no matter what we do to create a safer system for these users. If something bad happens out on the system, some severe injury or death, there's always a door open to basically blaming the users of the system and basically exonerating all of those who are supposed to be designing a safer system for road users in its wake. So the question really is, how do we want to structure responsibility in our system? And one proposal, and I think it's pretty solid, we can have a discussion about this, is that we maybe propose that the responsibility lies with those people and those groups, those agencies that have more sort of influence or more power to change elements of the system. So this is people that are regulators, that regulate our laws, regulate our vehicle designs. These are people and groups that design roadways. These are lawmakers that create laws that impact the way the impact the way our environments are designed and how we interact with those environments with other road users in them. So it's really a question of how do we want to advance this, and do we want to really continue allowing us to just interpret fallacies or mistakes out on the roadway as a function of this error that people like this myth that, Dan, I know you're going to be asking about, like the driver, 94% of crashes are due to driver error. You know, we're not going to be changing the system if it's really road users that are at fault predominantly.
Yeah.
We need to change that.
That's great, Seth. Thanks for queuing that up. Eric, before you get into it, I want to queue up a question. Some questions are coming in. Thanks for being active out there, everybody. We're talking big picture in a lot of ways about responsibility of the system as a whole. There's some questions coming in about what role, if any, does the personal responsibility of the individual road user play into this discussion? It gets brought up a lot, certainly, and especially I think as you see accounts of crashes shared, there's a lot of focus on, what were the folks doing? What were people doing in the crash, and what led up to the crash? What role does personal responsibility have in this discussion and within our understanding of shifting toward a safe system? That's a tough one. I'm sorry to just jump that on you. That's a great question. Coming from the
I'd love
audience.
to hear what Eric thinks about it. What's your take on that?
Just to that, I mean, one, there's a cultural thing where here we sort of have this idea of personal freedom, which has kind of become a culture of personal irresponsibility. Over aggressive driving, we don't provide much education, we don't receive comparable training to what other countries do. So certainly at a systemic level, people aren't receiving that basic knowledge that they ought to have to operate a vehicle. We let them operate it too young without sufficient training. But that said, you have the system that you have. It's generally not the case that somebody gets in the car and says, I want to kill a pedestrian today, or I'm really looking forward to that angle crash at an intersection, right? That most of the crashes that occur because people are making mistakes that one could reasonably expect to happen. In fact, you can predict them, right? They happen predictably in certain environments. And that may be the case that, older adults do this, right? They attempted to make a left turn, they misjudge the speed of the oncoming vehicle, and they get hit in angle collision. That's why older adults are overwhelmingly get injured and killed, right? They don't run over other people, they get T-boned, right? But they're not able to accurately judge the approaching speed of a vehicle moving at 40, 50 miles an hour, right? The visual deterioration that we have during the life cycle causes that to happen. Now, you can say, sure, they shouldn't have done that, and that may be true, but if you change that light from a permitted left turn to a protected one, the crash goes away. Right? So you can blame the victim in this case. And certainly they made an error in that context, or you can change the context, right? And we tend not to do that other thing. Down here, we're spending millions of dollars to go from that left turn and then the green ball to the left turn signal to the yellow flashing turn signal, right? And that's because we're not really willing to do the right thing at these intersections. We have a lot of older drivers down here in South Florida, but we'd really rather them die than inconvenience operations in any way. So it's, certainly there is some personal responsibility there, and there are bigger ways that we can foster a culture of responsibility. But a lot of the problems that we see are a combination of people doing things that you can realistically expect them to do in an environment that doesn't care.
I was on mute, apologies. Two more things came in, great comments, a two-part comment here. In a discussion of responsibility, we have to remember, one, who has the freedom to do differently? A lot of people choosing their travel, they're not choosing their travel mode, not choosing to walk to their job at night for their night shift. A lot of people, we've got to be thinking from the perspective of folks who have to be getting around in different ways at different times of day. That's a really great point. I added some examples to that, but that was a really good point. And then the second was, who benefits and who suffers from the current system? This person says the problem with cost-benefit analysis is it assumes that people who bear the brunt of the cost are the same people who reap the benefits, but maybe these are distributed unevenly. And I think that's a really interesting comment and point.
That's a great point. Yeah. And none of these are, the failures of the system, right? The misreads. Eric's done a lot of work on mistakes, errors, slips. These are born not proportionally across our population. Certainly those with fewer choices is one example of that. But yes, Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, there's another interesting point, and we're diving into this responsibility question again. I'm going to move us off to something new in a moment, but often comes up this issue of alcohol use. This is an important factor, I think, in some crashes. But this person says, how do you assign responsibility where there is a design flaw, but maybe this person says that in about a third of cases, deaths might have some role of alcohol. I'd have to, I don't know about that stat off the top of my head, but it is a factor, right? And that's a tricky issue. Is it boiled down to the personal responsibility? It's certainly maybe system failures and system solutions to a problem like that.
It's a great question, and it's true. A disproportionate number of our fatalities and serious injuries are alcohol driven. The question, another way to kind of interpret that question around responsibility is that whose responsibility is it to design the system of response to that, right? What generally happens after someone has been drinking and gets into a serious crash? It's kind of underwhelming what generally happens. We have leaky court systems. We often, if they have maybe a relationship with local magistrates, they get off or whatever it may be. A lot of drivers who struggle with these issues with drunk driving do so a number of times, dozens of times before getting caught the first time. So the question really becomes, are there other models out there that work really well? And the answer is yes. In fact, there are some more administrative models that when people are caught drunk driving, their driving privileges were removed for temporarily. Maybe their car is impounded, they lose their license, that's suspended for a while.
Yeah.
There are approaches that can help. And again, that's about the design of the system of response. Eric, please.
I feel with drunk driving, and follow me before you get upset, like I feel with distracted driving, which is we're too quick to say, oh, the person was under the influence of alcohol. Therefore, that's all we need to know about that crash. And we can disregard everything else that's occurred. It allows us to be completely ignorant. Certainly, people's perceptual reaction times get impaired, they become distracted, they engage in a whole suite of behaviors that are undesirable when they're drinking. But what we do then is we say, oh, we have this one piece of information. Therefore, everything else surrounding this crash that contributed to it can be entirely disregarded. And we're doing it with distracted driving now too. If we can shift all of the blame off to alcohol use, if we can shift it to cell phones, right, then that we can sort of absolve ourselves of responsibility, not a problem anymore. But people use alcohol throughout the world, right? They have just as many cell phones as Europe as they do here, right? There needs to be layers of defense, right? I mean, that when we're talking about a safe systems framework, and when I use systems, I know some people don't like me to use the S on that, but I'm thinking organizational system safety, right? You have multiple layers of defense so that if somebody's drinking, what additional layers are there to prevent the possible consequences of that? And when we just focus on that one thing, it allows us to ignore all of the other layers of defense, and it puts everyone at risk, right? And I get distracted driving is the one that drives me nuts now, right? That's the one that, if only we can get people to stay alert, stay alive. That's what we do in Florida, right? Don't drive distracted, the problem solved. Well, no, not really, because the latent hazard's still embedded in that environment. If anything, the alcohol or the cell phone exacerbates the risk that's already embedded in the system. And it's that systemic risk that we really want to focus on. If we can address that, the other things aren't going to matter quite as much.
Let me take that point, Eric, and shift it over to our next topic that we wanted to get into is this idea of crash investigation and crash reporting. Our understanding of what happens to a crash, in a crash and leading up to it comes from these crash reports. And we talked last time about one of the pitfalls in approaching a safe system is to have just one agency responsible for crash investigation and reporting. We want to move away from that. I'm curious, you cited last time some examples of how things are done in some European countries and how they perform crash investigations there. It's a departure, I think, from what we do here in the States. I wonder if either Seth or Eric would be willing to just summarize that and kind of get to maybe a shift, how we could shift in that right direction.
Sure. Yeah, well, I'll just start and I'll pass it over to Eric. We're starting to see shifts, Dan, in that. New York City, for instance, just very recently established the Serious Injury Response Tracking and Analysis Program, or STIRTA, where it's actually housed within the DOT, where after really all serious vehicular crashes, they review the street design, infrastructure. So what Eric is basically laying out with those latent demand variables that are out there, right? They look at the context in which these crashes are happening. They don't only look at the road users' behavior, which we often see. That's the most common way we see crash reported, often by local law enforcement agencies. They're looking at road users' behavior right preceding the crash. And of course, as we've been referencing, a lot of European models, they basically have crash investigation teams where they do precisely that. They do contextual analysis. They're usually multidisciplinary, so they have different perspectives out there. And instead start looking at, yes, all of those layers of protection. Where had things faltered? What can we shore up? What can we do differently? And do we have latent issues? Where else on the network might we have these, so that we can be proactive, right? In our kind of shoring up safety on our network. But Eric, yeah, love to hear you.
Yeah, no, I would just follow up that one of the more exciting things going on right now is Jennifer Homendy, now that she's taken over the National Transportation Safety Board, is really advocating that we start understanding serious traffic crashes just like we do airline crashes, freight crashes. I mean, we know how to address these things. We just treat traffic crashes like they're just this mundane part of our existence that we accept, and shifting our attention to understanding the underlying causes, the systemic factors that lead to them, and then trying to prevent those. That's one of the more promising things I see going on here right now, and it leaves me feeling quite hopeful.
Agreed.
Yeah, great points. Great points. I think we discount potentially the role that the benefit that a diverse group of perspectives could bring to this crash investigation process potentially. We know about road safety audits in that we're bringing a multidisciplinary team to an area to think about what could be done for safety, maybe applying that model to a crash investigation. Different people see different things and bring them up. We're bringing this list up of the 10 common pitfalls as we approach the end of our discussion period. But as we look through this list, I think that the point, and I won't take words out of your mouths, maybe you can react, but the point is that we're failing in a lot of ways, but we have successes across the board in getting to a safe system, I think, from where we have been. These are items that I think could be used by agencies, by community members who are pushing their leaders to do better, to think about as you're doing your work. Are we aligning with these? Do we think we could do a better job moving away from some of these pitfalls? And I wonder, as we close things out, the one question we got time and time again, Eric and Seth, was this frustration that we are still siloed in our ability and separated and segmented in our ability to shift toward a safe system, that different departments and different agencies do their work in different ways. How do we get to the point where those silos are fully broken down and we can agree on how to move forward? Not an easy question to end with, but I wonder if either you would want to take a crack at it.
Yeah, you need leadership to do it. I mean, you need leadership to do it. There were some questions that came in about how do we get engineers to be more accommodating and all that. And it's really easy. You tell their bosses to have, their bosses make them be accommodating, right? And there's no shortage of engineers who can do this stuff, right? I mean, there's a dozen off the top of my head. The problem is they don't often wind up in the right positions, right? You get them in the right positions by getting elected officials, by getting mayors to make that a priority. Right. And those silos get broken down really. As a project I was working on, the land use person didn't want to work with the transportation person, so they fired them both and put them both under public works. That was great. Silos eliminated, and it was a political decision, but it was the right decision. But to get that happen, you need the leadership to do it. And the challenge then becomes, how do you get stable leadership so that political priorities don't dissolve over time?
Yeah.
Great. Thanks.
Yeah, Dan, we see great examples across the US. We definitely wanted to highlight some of those and not say everything is failing. An example that always comes to mind is in Greenville, North Carolina, where we have local hospital system working with the local police and the local engineering. There's just a really great synergies there, right? When you have local police understanding where a lot of the problems are, like where a lot of the speeding is, or where there's a lot of near misses with pedestrians crossing streets. We have just seen that time and again, where people, once they start seeing that they have a common cause in safety, and they understand they have different perspectives, but different skills, and that when they combine these skills, when they integrate them, you can see some major gains, like with the law enforcement, seeing that there was problems in certain areas and certain corridors with pedestrians crossing. They conveyed that information over to the engineers, who then started installing medians, median islands, and pedestrian hybrid beacons. This is just a great example of using the keen observation powers of local law enforcement, and of course the design prowess of our engineering community. And again, holding each other accountable in monthly meetings and check-ins. There's just so much to be gained with breaking down these silos and really getting together and forming coalitions in the name of safety.
Yeah, thank you both. I think there's a lot of important work to be done, and the input and the feedback, the questions that came in from you all today is really great for moving this conversation forward. I think these conversations could be continuing in communities across the country as you grapple with how to move your safety programs in this direction. So let me thank Eric, Dumbaugh, Seth, LaJeunesse for your time during this webinar and the previous session. Look back at the recordings if you want to get more information on this, and we'll continue doing these webinars. Stay tuned with us, CSERS, for these research to practice bites that we have coming every month. So thank you all very much. We'll see you next time.